Hey everybody, and welcome back to Demystifying DMing. I'm Sam, and let's get right into some DM tips. Alright, last week we talked about some tips for how to actually run the game when you have it at the table, and the week before that we talked about how to prep your first session, but now we need to talk about prepping sessions after that first one. Prepping is basically any part of the game that takes place when you're not at the table. Any of the work you do as a DM that's not done with your players in front of you, that's prepping. Now, you could spend a lot of time prepping. You could pretty much spend the entire week leading up to your game prepping, but that's going to get you burned out really quickly. What I want to do today is try and find a way to help you find that happy medium between prepared enough and not burnt out and spending an entire week prepping. Now, there's no one way to prep. Every DM has their own different style and way they prep, so I'm not going to be able to tell you the exact way that you should prep, but I'm going to try and give you some tips and some things to watch out for, and maybe some things to consider. For the most part, prepping is about finding that happy medium that I mentioned. Prepping enough that you feel prepared so that when you're in the moment with your players, you don't panic and suddenly feel like you don't know what's going on. But at the same time, again, you don't want to prep too much. Now, what too much is in terms of prepping can be a number of things. It doesn't have to just be the amount of work that you put into it. It can also be things like being too rigid with your structure and feeling like you need to then railroad players into things because you're too prepared to be flexible. The rule of thumb I go with is that you should prep two things: what you want to happen and for what the players are going to do. And those can be two completely different things, and you generally want to prepare for both. One really good place to start is basically prepping what's there. Wherever the players are, prep the things that you know for a fact are present. Characters, monsters, locations, dungeons, towns, cities, all of these things that you know are definitely going to be there. Those are good things to start with. Now, the amount of detail you put into those things can vary because you don't want to put complete detail into absolutely everything and have your players only use two of the things, because then you feel like you put in a lot of work that you didn't use. So the key here is trying to figure out a way to make it so that you can maximize what you use in your game without forcing your players to do the things only you want to do. Now, in just a minute, I'm going to go over how to do these things effectively so that you can make sure you use the things that you prep without necessarily forcing the players to go to those places or talk to those people. However, for something like a dungeon, that's the kind of thing where you do want to prep that exhaustively. You want to prep absolutely everything. You want to have a drawn-out map. You want to know where all the traps are, what every monster is, where all the loot is. All of this stuff, you want to know exactly where it is before you go into it, because it's such a small, contained area. You know the players are basically going to be looking at it under a magnifying glass, and you want to make sure that you know everything about it so you can answer any questions they have and know exactly what's going on from moment to moment. When it comes to something like a city, on the other hand, that's a lot bigger, a lot more complex, and you don't want to prep every single little thing because you're going to go out of your mind trying to figure out how many florists exactly should be on this street, and what the street names are, and the name of every person living in that city. That is way too much work that you not only shouldn't do, but you also probably can't do it in a reasonable amount of time, unless it's like a city of 30 people, in which case that's more like a hamlet. So, how do we do it? How do we take, say, a city, for example, a giant 200,000 person city, and make it feel like it's fully alive and present and interesting, and the players can go and do whatever they want, without prepping all 200,000 people that live there and all of their shops, homes, streets, and everything? Well, this is where I like to say that in addition to sort of the stuff you want to happen as a DM, the general story beats, the encounters, the dungeons, the stuff that you're going to prep very specifically and in a concrete way of just sort of this is how it's going to happen, you also want to prep yourself a set of tools so that you can kind of add to things on the fly at the table. I've said it before, improvisation is a key skill when it comes to DMing, and you can prep to improvise. Now, one of the key ways to prep to improvise is to have some handy random generators ready to go, because those can give you all kinds of things. A random name generator is a must, in my opinion, when it comes to prepping. If you're running with a laptop or a phone or any sort of internet-capable device, you want to make sure you have a tab pulled up already with a name generator ready to go that's appropriate for your campaign, so that way you don't have to be like Googling it while you're trying to figure out what the guard's name is. And this gives you a lot of freedom, because if you don't necessarily need to figure out what everyone's name is ahead of time, this allows you to trust that you can come up with it in the moment and just go, oh, what is this dwarf's name? Click, his name is Thorgald. Say hello to Thorgald, everybody. And then your players feel like you're really prepared because, wow, we just asked a random person on the street what his name is, and you were able to tell us like that. It's a really good feeling when you can pull off that kind of sleight of hand with your players, where it feels like you have prepped absolutely everything, when really it's just you're making it up as you go. Again, first thing you want to have in your toolbox is a random name generator. There's tons of them out there. My favorite one is fantasy name generators. It is huge, it has all kinds of stuff, and specifically has a Dungeons & Dragons section divided up by race, so that you can go in and click like Bugbear, Azamar, Elf, Half-Elf, Halfling, all of these things. It just comes up with them for you. And that way you can kind of just click, there you go, there's a name. One trick I've figured out that's really helped to sell this and make it seem like this character has always had this name and I'm not just pulling it out of a generator in that moment, is distract the players with something else while you're trying to figure out the name. Don't necessarily just draw out your words and be like, well, my name is click. That's a little obvious is what you're doing, and the players will forgive you, they won't care. But if you really want to do this little extra bit of theater and make it seem like this person has always had this name, distract them with something else. Have the character or whatever's going on, whatever is happening around them as they're trying to get this name, have something else happen or interrupt them or kind of segue in a way that will then distract them for a moment while you look it up and decide on the name off to your side. And this can be anything, but basically as long as it's just not anything related to the name. For example, if they go up to a guard and ask, hey guard, what's your name? Or if they're talking to the guard and they say, oh, thank you so much, this has been so helpful. Oh, by the way, what was your name? Instead of being like, oh, well, my name is, click. Instead, you could have the guard basically say, oh, hang on. Aren't you those adventurers that saved everybody from that fire the other day? Thank you so much for that. We really appreciate your service. Oh, and I'm so sorry. My name is Ferdinand. It seems a lot more fluid, and it kind of helps distract for a moment what you're doing. It's a little bit of smoke and mirrors, and they'll notice if you do it the same way too often, but generally it can kind of help to fill in that seam a little bit so the players don't necessarily notice when you're looking up a name. Another thing that helps is just having a list of names you already like, written down, printed out, set up somewhere else, so that way if the players ask for a name, you can just kind of go down the list and you have these ones already prepared. Now we can take this to the next level, and this is kind of what I was talking about earlier with that ability to prepare things in a way that you can make sure they end up in front of the players, but you don't force the players to go to those things. Instead, we're going to bring the things you prep to the players. Characters and adventure hooks are really the two easiest things to do this with, and the ones that I would recommend. Characters especially. When it comes to preparing characters, especially in a location, I like to populate this location with a bunch of characters. I'll just sit down, come up with a bunch of them, how they know each other, how they might be connected to the players, all these interesting things about them so that I can use them on the fly when I need them. But then, I won't necessarily put them anywhere in particular. I'll kind of just leave them off to the side, keep a bank of characters, and maybe have some places they could potentially be, some things they could potentially be connected to, but generally speaking, leave them kind of ill-defined and off to the side. And then, say I've prepared a guard character, a captain of the guard character, a priest, a crime boss, a guild leader, and the head of the city. All those are probably kind of important people to know about. And then, say if the players really want to talk to a guard, instead of just having to pull a random guard out of nowhere, what if we grab this one guard that we already made? He's got a personality, a family, he's even got some adventure hooks tied to him. What if that's the guard they're talking to? Now it seems like everyone around could be this person with a deep backstory and history and connections and personality and stuff that you've prepped already, because they are, because you can kind of throw them in front of the players as they go and interact with people. Now, it's impossible to predict everywhere the players will want to go and everyone they will want to talk to, so you're not going to be able to do this for literally every person they interact with. But as you get practicing and playing, you'll get a good idea of the kind of places they go and the kind of people you will need, and you can kind of start to prepare a good bank of characters. Now, what happens if these characters go unused? Well, then the players didn't see them, did they? Remember, if the players don't see it, it doesn't exist. Say that captain of the guard character that you really liked and was kind of tied into a bunch of things and was really cool and had some interesting history. They never encountered them or heard about them. That person can maybe be the captain of the guard of the next city they go to. Or they could be a veteran soldier in the army they're encountering, or any other person that kind of fits that archetype, and you can just move them and shuffle them around and keep reusing these people if they don't get used. Now, does that seem like cheating? Maybe a little bit, but again, you already prepared this person, might as well use them, and if the players never encounter them, don't throw them away, reuse it. You can do the exact same thing with adventure hooks, and the way I like to do this is basically write out a page of possible encounters, adventures, interesting things, one sentence long, and just as many as I can think of that I could then pull from, especially if the players are in somewhere like a city where there's going to be a lot of interaction and it's kind of going to be a hub for them for a bit. You don't have to have these completely fleshed out when you write them down, and you don't even have to have them fully fleshed out when you give them to the players for the first time. Ideally, you should have some idea and maybe be able to improvise the beginning of them, but for the most part, if the players bite, latch on, and decide they want to investigate this, that's when you can know, oh, next week I'll prep that. Now, you have to be careful with this because it does run the risk of the players immediately wanting to go and follow up on these hooks and you not necessarily having them prepped. Now, this is where it comes down to your style of DMing. If this is something you're worried about, maybe write down a little bit more than just the basic information that you need for each of these, and maybe have a couple of characters, some names, some locations, some things this is tied to, so that way they can go and start investigating, and you know, for the most part, what's going to happen for the first 15, 20 minutes or so of that adventure, maybe even the first hour, knowing players and how long they can take to do things. Another thing this does with both the characters and the adventure hooks is it gives things to be like small talk and gossip they can overhear if they're walking through town, and that's what makes things really seem immersive. If, as they're walking through, you can kind of just idly mention something about, oh, did you hear the guard captain's daughter got eaten by an ooze? Wow, that's interesting, and probably an adventure hook that you might have an idea of. You can pull from that, and it's kind of interesting, but then you don't need to be fully invested in it in case the players decide, nah, we're not going to investigate that. Now, of course, if there is something that is absolutely essential to your plot or description in an area, like, say, for example, the mayor of a town is a vampire and is slowly feeding on all of his townspeople and seeding the town with vampire spawn so he can slowly take over the countryside, that's probably something that's important that the characters are there to investigate. You are probably going to want to know the vampire's name, where their coffin is, the layout of their lair, who is in the know, who is a vampire spawn, what kind of clues could the players get that could lead them to this mystery, where are the vampire spawn, where are they located, probably have an idea of what the town looks like. Anything that you know you want to happen and is pretty much kind of scripted to happen, is the main quest, so to speak, you generally want to have prepped pretty explicitly. The improvising and the toolbox stuff works really, really well to help players give them stuff that they can kind of branch off to the sides and investigate and follow their own interests, so that way they know they can, so that they're not just stuck following the story you're providing them, and they can kind of create their own story off to the sides as well. And especially if you can tie that back into your main story, and say one of the side plots that you had them do that was just an adventure hook you came up with ended up being really interesting and they were really animated and excited about it and invested, maybe there's a way that you could possibly tie that into the main plot and it was important and there was secretly a clue there that led them to the vampire or something. Some of the best fiction is based in retcon, and just like how George Lucas didn't know that Luke and Leia were siblings when he first started Star Wars, and especially when they kissed, you don't necessarily need to know at the beginning of an adventure how it connects to everything else in the world. Maybe by the end of that adventure, you could figure out, huh, that did line up pretty well. I guess that's tied in. Feel free to do that. Along with those adventure hooks, it can be a good idea to kind of research some monsters and potential encounters, just again, to have as a bank, just like with the characters, that you can throw at the players if they go somewhere where you're like, oh yeah, there should be an encounter here. You have something prepared and you're not trying to flip through the monster manual and try and create something on the fly, because outside of some very rare instances, those encounters tend to be the weakest. Encounter building is generally something you don't want to just make up on the spot, and you probably want to prepare a little bit ahead of time to make it interesting. I'm actually going to do a whole video on prepping encounters and a whole video on running encounters, because they're such a core central part of D&D and kind of difficult to do. So, take that to mean, don't necessarily feel like you can just plan these encounters on the go and just flip through the monster manual to something appropriate, because that's how you get encounters that are either boring or kill players when you don't want to. That being said, if you're looking for interesting ideas to start adventures, especially monster-based adventures, my biggest piece of advice that I've kind of only figured out recently, he said sheepishly, is read the monster manual. And I'm not talking about the stat blocks. I'm talking about all that lovely text around the stat blocks that I had for years ignored. I admit I'm guilty of this. But recently, I've been spending a lot more time looking into that text and actually reading it and seeing just the rich lore that Wizards of the Coast has put into those entries for us. And there is so much there that is interesting that can lead you to create some really, really interesting encounters. The most recent one for me was that I had a low-level party that was just getting together. It was their first session. They needed a monster to go after, and they also needed something to kind of tie them together as a party. So I decided to go with a ghoul infesting the sewers. Now, I could have just put a ghoul down there and had it been like, all right, go down there, you walk down, there's a ghoul, great, you fight it, maybe you get paralyzed, we're done. As I was reading all of this text above the stat block and all their interesting origins and things like that, you learn things like, for example, elves are immune to a ghoul's paralytic touch because of their origin. That's really interesting. They also have ties to a specific elven god. It's not mentioned in the monster manual, but, pick one. That gives some very interesting depth, especially because one of my players was a monster hunter and one of my players was a changeling who happened to look like an elf at the moment. So the monster hunter was like, oh, hey, I'm going after a ghoul, and I need an elf because you can't be paralyzed by it. Come on with. And it was a great way for them to come together that felt natural. So when it comes to planning adventures and planning encounters and planning things like that, take a look through the monster manual, read through it, and see what inspiration strikes you. In addition, speaking of inspiration, don't feel the need to reinvent the wheel here. Feel free to steal from things, reskin, change stuff around. It is okay to do that, and in fact, encouraged, because unless you're getting paid to do this, no one really cares if you plagiarize. I think I said that in my second or first video. One thing to help prevent burnout and give yourself some insight into other ideas and bring in kind of other creative thoughts into your process, look through DM's Guild, for example. Throw a creator a couple of bucks for their creation. I know it says pay what you want, but give them a couple of dollars. Don't just take it for free. They worked hard on that. Grab a couple of short adventures from there, read through them, maybe chop them up, put them into your game, or put them into your game completely, and it gives you some fresh ideas that you don't necessarily have to prep, and if the players go for it, great, and you get this really cool new adventure. If the players don't go for it, well, then you don't necessarily feel like you wasted your time because you didn't necessarily prep all of this. Someone else did that work for you, and you can feel more free to just follow where the players are going and follow their interest. So again, my biggest piece of advice for this was basically prepare to improvise. Give yourself the toolbox necessary so that way when it comes to actually sitting down at the table, you have prepared things that you can put in front of the players and you can give them to work with, but don't necessarily set them in such concrete, static places that you can't be flexible and move them to where the players are going. Don't necessarily prepare things like it's a video game where it's just a straight select path, and if the players go off the path, there's nothing there. Prep it more like these sort of isolated little bubbles of encounters or characters and locations, and kind of spread them out and be able to put them where the players end up going. Now, it's a little bit harder to do these kind of things with, like, say, location, where you want to shuffle it around a bit. When it comes to very large locations, like, say, the Grand Cathedral, or the Palace, or even districts within a city, those are ones you're going to want to have as static landmarks that kind of stay put and are going to be where they're going to be. Probably because they're important locations that you're kind of going to use as anchor points for a lot of things anyway. However, smaller things like a shop, or a house, or an inn, those things can be easily moved around wherever you need them to be, as long as the players haven't seen them yet. As soon as the players see it, unless it's magic, that's where it's going to stay. Now, a way you could use this is, say you've come up with this really cool alchemist shop. You've got a name, you've got the interior planned out, you have a really interesting owner, you know one of your players is interested in alchemy, some interesting reagents, a couple plot hooks, all of this stuff. You want these players to interact with it, but you don't necessarily have to put it anywhere in particular, because as soon as you put it somewhere specific, it makes it harder for the players to find it, or get to it, or run into it. So, the easiest way you can do that is don't necessarily give it a hard and fast specific location. You can give a place that you'd prefer it to be, sort of like, well, if I had to pick somewhere, it would be here. Like, if I had to pick somewhere, it would be in the University District. But maybe it doesn't necessarily have to be in the University District, and it'll be kind of wherever is most convenient for it to be wherever the players happen to be to run into it. Here's one way this can play out. You've got this alchemist shop prepared, you've got it sitting in your notes, you've got it all ready to go, and the players are wandering through the docks district, and they don't really have an idea of what to do. They're trying to figure out where to go. They're a little aimless at the moment. They're in need of a hook. And you know that one of the party members has been looking for an alchemist shop. They've been interested in alchemy, and as they're walking down the street, you can say, oh, hey, by the way, as you're kind of walking around and thinking and talking, you, person interested in alchemy, look down a side street and you see a sign down the street with a bubbling cauldron on it. And that seems to indicate to you that it's probably a place that sells alchemy supplies. One thing that can do is what I talked about in my last video, managing spotlight. Say that player is not really gotten to spend some time in the spotlight, be the center of attention, and they've got this interest that you know about. You can use this to kind of let them direct the action for a bit. If the party doesn't have anything else to do, nothing better to do, and they want to be like, oh, hey, everybody, could I go and check out this shop? Do you want to come with me? And they're like, yeah, sure, why not? We don't have anything better to do. They're suddenly getting to lead the way, and it gives them time to be in the spotlight. And it also gives you an opportunity to then give them a little bit of a hook, take something that you wanted them to run into anyway, and put it in front of them. Because one thing I've learned is that if you prep some really, really cool stuff, but are very specific about where it is and how they're going to run into it, there's a good chance they're not going to run into it, and you're going to spend a lot of time prepping things that don't end up getting used. Be flexible with how it shows up. Be open to it appearing in the moment and coming to you as you're playing, and you'll end up using a lot more of what you prepped, because it doesn't have to be in one specific spot or happen after they talk to one specific person. It's a lot more fluid and able to be adjusted based on what the players are doing, how they're feeling, and what they're interested in the moment. Now, this is entirely situational. You can prep entirely toolbox stuff like I've been talking about it and just be open to letting the players do what they want to do and kind of doing a sandbox-based campaign. That works great. If you want to do something like that, I would direct your attention to something called a hex crawl. It's a very exploration-based kind of campaign style that takes a lot of prep at the very beginning, but after that kind of runs itself and is very interesting. Or if you want to just run kind of a sandbox campaign, let's just figure stuff out as we go, highly improvised, that's great too. But for the most part, I'm going to figure a lot of people want a middle-of-the-road kind of strategy. A good number of things that they have prepped, specific story beats, villains, characters, arcs, and that sort of stuff that they've pre-planned, and then room for the players to deviate and mess around that you can then improvise around, as opposed to wholly one or the other. Again, this does vary session by session, though. If the party is already in a dungeon and you know they're not going to finish the dungeon by the end of the session, prep the dungeon. You don't really necessarily have to have stuff prepared to improvise because you know just about everything there is. It's still a good idea to have some ways to improvise in a dungeon, like maybe have some encounters that could be thrown in, added, subtracted, that kind of thing, so that you can adjust to what the players are doing and how it's going for them. For example, if the players do want something unexpected, like decide to camp in the middle of the dungeon, and you don't have anything prepped for that, it can help to have a little bit of leeway there so that you can adjust on the fly when they do something unexpected like that. For the most part, though, when you start to think in terms of these little pieces, these little things that you can use as tools and improvise around, it can be really fun to prep then because you don't necessarily have to sit down and do a whole bunch of writing and preparing. You can kind of just jot down little ideas as you go throughout your day and kind of compile those together and flesh some out to create this toolbox that you can have off to your side that you can prep and gradually build up on. Because, again, if it doesn't get used in a particular session, you can just keep using that stuff. You can keep having it ready to go in case the players encounter it. Now, of course, for things like encounters, you want to up the level and things like that, up the challenge. Maybe. It's entirely possible you want to leave it easy, too, for them, because players need a win. In terms of formatting, it is entirely up to a particular DM what their style of format for their notes and their DM prep looks like. I will link below what my general kind of template is that I use to prep, but again, this is a highly, highly personalized thing that is very much up to the individual and up to you to figure out what works best. So this is just kind of an example of what I've come up with at this point for me. Now, my format is very much based in places with a lot of characters present, like towns or cities or any sort of location where there's characters established and sitting around ready to interact with the players, as opposed to like heavy wilderness exploration or a dungeon. You'd want probably a different format for those. I will link that below, and either in the comments here or in the Discord, if you have a format or a way that you set up your notes to prepare for D&D as a DM, then please come by and share them with us, again, either down below or in the Discord, so that your fellow DMs and I can see how you're doing that. We can kind of collaborate and people can see different ways of looking at things and different ways of preparing. Because, again, I can only provide my point of view on this, and there's so very many ways to do this that no one way is going to work for everybody. Alright, folks. Hopefully you found these tips helpful and they will help you feel like you are prepared to prep your campaign and you have an idea of where you want to go with this and how much time you want to spend on toolbox improv kind of prepping, and more concrete, solid, story point and encounter kind of prepping. Again, stop by the Mimics and Monstrosities Twitch channel to see us every week play some D&D. Also, this YouTube channel is where you can find all of our VODs, and stop by the Discord if you want to talk to us about anything, ask me any questions, or share those DM prep documents with us so we can see exactly how everybody sets up their prep. Until next time, guys, remember, your players are having more fun than you think they are. Have a good rest of your day.